Imagine suddenly becoming invisible to everyone around you. That's the bizarre predicament this guy finds himself in after waking up as a ghost. Now he must unravel the mystery of his condition and find a way to communicate with others. It all starts with a lively dinner party outside a house celebrating Nick's special day. His mom delivers a heartfelt speech mentioning his late dad. Feeling overwhelmed, Nick abruptly leaves the table to cut a cake adorned with his face. Inside the house, he contemplates his existence, holding a pistol to his ghostly form. But just as he's about to pull the trigger, he jolts awake. It was all a dream. Now at breakfast with his mom, Nick's quirky smiley face pancakes reflect his inner turmoil. He tentatively broaches the subject of a writing course in London, met with lukewarm reception from his mom. Disheartened, his breakfast smile turns upside down. Pedaling to school on his bicycle, Nick engages in a clandestine homework exchange, trading assignments with a classmate. Amidst the hustle, his girlfriend surprises him with an invite to a party. Regrettably, he declines, citing prior commitments. As Nick navigates his ghostly existence, each encounter unveils layers of his surreal predicament, leaving him grappling with his newfound invisibility and the complexities of human connection. Next, we encounter a tense confrontation involving two guys and a girl demanding money from another individual who apparently owes them. The gang's leader brandishes a knife, but her threat is merely superficial, resulting in a minor scratch on the debtor's finger. Shifting scenes, we find ourselves in Nick's classroom, where a peer reads aloud Nick's homework assignment. When the teacher prompts Nick to surpass his classmate's effort, he confidently takes center stage, delivering a poignant piece of poetry. Despite his earnest performance, his classmates appear disinterested, swiftly exiting the room as soon as the bell rings. In the cafeteria, Nick consoles his friend Pete, urging him to assert himself and resist being bullied. Pete expresses his inability to stand up for himself, prompting Nick to intervene on his behalf. Nick resolves Pete's debt issue, confronting Annie, the aggressor, and subtly challenging her arrogance. Annie retaliates with physical force, landing punches on Nick's face. Later, Nick and Annie find themselves in the principal's office, engaging in a candid conversation. Annie confronts Nick about his hypocrisy for selling essays, prompting him to acknowledge his flaws. The principal dismisses Annie, emphasizing Nick's potential and urging him not to squander it on lost causes like Annie Newton. Meanwhile, at Annie's home, tensions simmer as she returns to her stepmother's care, joining her brother for dinner. An altercation erupts between Annie and her stepmother when she confronts her about an undisclosed issue. This sparks a heated argument between her father and stepmother, but Annie retreats upstairs, preparing a sandwich for her brother Victor. Victor inquires about her plans for the evening, to which she responds affirmatively, noting his shift in mood. Meanwhile, at Nick's house, Pete arrives and jests about Nick getting beaten up by a girl, drawing a relatable reaction. Pete raises the topic of an upcoming party, prompting Nick to reveal his departure for London the next day to attend a writer's program, unbeknownst to his mother. Nick asserts his independence, determined not to succumb to his mother's micromanagement. Elsewhere, Andy accompanies her boyfriend Marcus in a car as they embark on a jewelry store heist. Marcus shatters the storefront glass, grabs jewelry, and flees back to their Mercedes, where Andy awaits. The following morning, Andy prepares for school, carrying the bag Marcus requested her to hold. However, she refuses to leave it with him, prompting Marcus to secretly alert the police via phone, betraying her trust. At school, Annie stashes the bag in her locker, unaware of Marcus's betrayal. As she shuts her locker, she notices Pete glaring at her. Moments later, the police arrive, discovering stolen jewelry in her locker and subsequently apprehending her. After calling Marcus from the police station and briefing him on the situation, Annie assures him that she knows who betrayed them and vows to handle it. Determined to seek revenge on the individual she believes betrayed her to the authorities, she leaves the station with retribution on her mind. Meanwhile, Pete bids farewell to Nick, and Nick returns home to find his mother aware of his London ticket. His mother confronts him about the ticket, expressing shock that he planned to leave without informing her, feeling as though she's been living with a stranger. Nick, preparing to depart, pockets a watch before leaving his room. As Pete walks briskly, he's suddenly attacked by Annie's associates, who drag him to her. Convinced Pete is the one who betrayed her, Annie assaults him, demanding a confession. Overwhelmed by the torture, Pete falsely implicates his best friend, Nick. But Pete's rationale isn't that of a betrayer. There's more to the story than meets the eye. He had hoped that Nick would have already left the country by now, leaving Annie without a target for her rage. However, Nick's flight delay changes the game. At the party, Nick offers his girlfriend the ticket, indicating he's changed his mind about going to London, likely influenced by his mother's speech. This shift in plans doesn't bode well for anyone. On his way back home, a car begins chasing Nick and eventually forces him into a ditch. It's Annie and her gang ready to exact revenge. Despite Pete's attempts to explain himself, they ignore him. Pete picks up Nick and taunts him, but Nick still defiantly responds, "You are." It's a fatal mistake. A hard kick to the face ends Nick's life. They dispose of his body in a hole, inadvertently dropping Nick's watch in the process. Pete's involvement in Nick's murder is unforgivable. How could he allow himself to be part of such a horrific act against his best friend? He confesses to Marcus, knowing Annie's ruthlessness. When Annie visits Marcus, he can see the fear in her eyes because he knows she's targeting the wrong person. Feeling betrayed, Marcus sends her away, unaware of the full extent of her misguided vendetta. She accuses him of being the one who betrayed her, wrecking some of his workshop items in anger before giving him a bitter kiss and departing. The next morning she burns the clothes she wore the previous night. What comes next is unbelievable. Nick emerges from the woods, looking unscathed and immaculate. He heads to school, takes his seat in class, but there's a catch: no one can see him. He's invisible, which, relatable. Despite being right there, no one acknowledges him, allowing them to vent about him freely. Even his girlfriend calls him pretentious, questioning his need to feel important. It's like, who can you trust these days? Not even your best friend, apparently. Initially, Nick thinks they're just messing with him until he tries throwing a book, only to realize it doesn't budge from the table. Then he attempts to call his mom from the principal's office, but she can't see or hear him, John Cena mode activated. Desperate, he shouts to her, hearing her conversation with detectives about him, though she remains oblivious to his presence. On his way home, he accidentally collides with someone in the school hallway and even gets run over by a truck. But in real life, nada. Arriving home, he finds detectives scouring the house, his mother distressed. He tries to convey his presence to her, even saying he's dead, but she can't perceive him. Currently, he's just wandering the streets. If I found out I was invisible, I'd be doing a lot more than just walking the streets. Anyway, detectives Brian and Kate are making progress with their investigation. They spoke to the principal, who mentioned Nick got into a fight with Annie. So, they head to Annie's house. Interestingly, Brian knew Annie when she was little because her dad used to be a cop. They interrogate Annie, asking her about her whereabouts last night. Nick supervises her lies but also learns that Annie attacked him because she believed he betrayed her. In a fit of anger, he tries to throw her off the roof, but, well, that doesn't quite work. The detectives organize a search party in the woods where Nick's body was supposedly dumped. Annie calls Pete, instructing him to be there. Nick overhears this and feels sick. Back in his room, he watches his mom sift through his belongings. She reads a poem he wrote, and he reads along with her. His pet bird joins him in his invisible state, and when it disappears from his hands, he has a revelation: I'm alive. He rushes to where his body was dumped, attempting to get the search party's attention, but humans prove unresponsive. However, a dog catches his attention briefly before turning away at the last moment. The dog assists in finding Nick's watch. Meanwhile, Pete reports to Annie and the gang, fearing they'll soon be discovered. He suggests going to the police but warns them that reporting means jail time for all. Meanwhile, Nick is stealthily listening to everything. He sneaks back into Annie's house as she's packing up to run away. Victor wakes up and tearfully asks if she's leaving like Mom did, a heartbreaking moment. Though seemingly tough, she shows her soft side with Victor, advising him never to follow her path. When her dad enters and instructs her to leave, she agrees but warns that if anything happens to Victor, she'll return and hold him accountable. As she departs, Nick delivers one of his monologues, asserting that her dysfunctional family dynamic doesn't excuse her actions. The search in the woods intensifies, with helicopters and ambulances deployed. A professional estimates that if Nick is alive out there, he has 2 to 3 days at most. A visual shows Nick's body, with his fingers twitching. He's indeed alive. Detective Brian pays Marcus a visit, questioning him about his whereabouts on Tuesday night. Marcus claims he was with Annie, but when asked about the jewelry store robbery the night before, he denies any involvement. Brian subtly hints at Marcus's parole status before leaving his card, expressing interest in discussing a missing person case at their school involving Annie. Brian ensures Marcus knows that he's aware of the exact car brand stolen the same night as the jewelry store robbery. Meanwhile, Nick is explaining to his mom that this revelation won't change anything because she always maintains control. He imagines himself shouting, shaking her, and causing chaos, but in reality, his mom breaks down, crying and calling out Nick's name. Pete takes a walk in the rain when Marcus suddenly appears, pointing a gun at his chest, revealing that he's being followed by the police. Marcus coerces Pete into revealing the location where Nick's body was dumped. The following day, Marcus attempts to deceive Annie into meeting him, but she senses something is amiss, so she instructs Pete to go instead. Pete is trailed by Detective Kate, unbeknownst to him. Annie observes from a distance as Pete meets Marcus and the others on a bridge. Suddenly, Marcus approaches Annie from behind, holding a gun to her back, and takes her to the bridge. He sends Pete away just before the police arrive. Ethan grabs a shotgun, and tension escalates as they face off against the cops. Annie, displaying remarkable survival instincts, manages to escape, much to Nick's concern. As she flees, Nick screams out warnings, but Annie, possibly injuring him inadvertently, turns back and shouts something.
So, Nick's calling out, she heard me.
Annie heads to a club, selling a ring that belonged to Marcus. After the sale, she decides to stay and dance, shedding her hoodie and beanie to reveal her moves, while Nick watches. The next day, she visits her mother's grave, expressing remorse. Nick, contemplating the pressure from his mom, wishes sometimes it were she who had passed away instead of his dad. He reaches out to Annie, urging her to reveal where his body is, but she walks away. He follows her as she breaks into the school at night, leaving money for Victor in her locker. Nick informs her he's dying and she's his only hope, but she can't see him despite hearing his voice. Feeling miserable, Annie takes a shower, and Nick, being respectful, avoids looking. Meanwhile, Nick, in the open grave, wakes up as Annie sleeps on the basketball court. Unaware, she's oblivious to Nick's presence, immersed in nostalgia while looking through his old photos. Nick's seemingly smiling, despite his decaying body, until his mom interrupts, dispelling any budding romance. Nick flees the house, running into the woods. They dispose of Nick's body, but lo and behold, it's gone. Nick informs Annie that someone moved his body, prompting her investigation. Discovering remnants linking Pete to the scene, she confronts him at school. Pete, surprisingly, admits Nick didn't betray her and confesses to moving the body with Marcus. Determined, Annie tracks down Marcus and confronts him near a police station. She coerces him to kneel at the edge of a precipice, gun in hand, in a role reversal moment. Meanwhile, Pete attempts self-harm, oblivious to Nick's pleas. In a surreal twist, Pete and Nick, in limbo between life and death, converse, questioning each other about the body's whereabouts. As Pete and Mark simultaneously provide answers, Annie's quest for justice intensifies. As Pete's parents rush into his room and discover his condition, Annie swiftly departs from Marcus, intent on finding Nick. However, her decision to spare Marcus proves costly as he retaliates by shooting her. Miraculously, Annie survives, retaliating with gunfire before alerting Detective Brian to Nick's whereabouts. She instructs him to retrieve something for her brother from her locker. Meanwhile, the police race to the dam where Nick's body lies. Despite Nick's efforts to reach his body, he's unable to save himself as the dam gates open, causing him to drown. Amidst the chaos, Kate orders the gates closed, and the authorities frantically search for Nick. Eventually, Brian locates Nick, and they rush him to the ambulance, where Annie observes from a distance, still bleeding from her wounds. Annie experiences a momentary blackout as she gets into her car, only to be awakened later by a police officer. Ignoring the officer's instructions, she drives away, triggering a pursuit. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Nick's mother anxiously watches the medical team working to save her son. As the police close in on Annie, surrounding her with guns drawn, she hears Nick's voice in her head, pleading for her help. This inner call to action ignites her determination, and she floors the accelerator, crashing through the police blockade. Abandoning her car, Annie continues on foot, guided by Nick's instructions. Ultimately, she arrives at the hospital, where Nick's mother confronts her with disbelief and anger. Despite Nick's attempts to intervene, his mother remains unaware of his presence, unable to hear his pleas for peace. In this pivotal moment, Annie finds herself alone, tasked with the responsibility of reaching out to Nick. However, she faces resistance when Nick's mother slaps her in disbelief. Despite this, Nick insists that his presence is real, urging his mother to acknowledge Annie's connection to him. Following Nick's guidance, Annie recounts a personal memory shared with Nick, emphasizing their bond. She pleads with Nick's mother to allow her to see him, believing she can somehow help him. Reluctantly, Nick's mother relinquishes her gun and grants Annie permission to enter. Inside, Annie tenderly interacts with Nick's body, expressing remorse and begging him not to leave. She places her necklace, a cherished memento, in his hand, joining him on the bed in a heartfelt embrace. As they share this intimate moment, the invisible barrier between them dissipates, and the real Nick awakens, calling out Annie's name. Nick acknowledges Annie's noble intentions, affirming that she has indeed saved him. Later, we see Victor playing with a toy plane, and Nick appears, suggesting they send a message to Annie. Victor's message is simple: "Hey, Annie." Nick inscribes it on the plane, and together they fly it, symbolizing a poignant connection beyond the physical realm. In the end, the moral of the story remains elusive, but the emotional resonance is undeniable, leaving a lingering sense of sadness.